I've heard that in Ireland, the dead don't rest quietly, that even the land remembers grief. Maybe that's why I came back. Maybe I needed to hear something that would finally make sense of the silence that followed my father's death. He died in spring, not long ago. Quietly, they said. In his sleep, they said. But I don't believe that, because I heard something else. The night he passed, I woke up with the taste of soil in my mouth, and a sound, not quite human, not quite animal. A wail, coming from somewhere past the hedge line. We weren't close, me and him, not since the accident. Not since he buried himself in that damn bog cottage, miles from anywhere, surrounded by mist and rot and secrets. But he left the place to me in his will, along with something else, something I don't fully understand yet. It took me nearly a week to drive up from Cork. I was stalling, honestly. Who wants to inherit a moss-covered ruin with a broken chimney and a history nobody talks about? The only people who ever visited that house were the priest and sometimes old Bridget from the village, who left food on the steps, like she was feeding an animal too proud to beg. But I went. I packed what I could, told my job I needed time to settle affairs, and I made the drive. The last few kilometers were almost impassable. Narrow roads, trees growing in from both sides. The tires caught something sharp on the gravel track and I had to stop. That's when I saw it. A crow, bigger than any I'd seen. Just standing in the road, watching. Not flinching, not flying, just staring. I got back in and drove through it, or tried to. It was gone when I looked again. I should have turned back then. The first night in the cottage was colder than I expected. Damp crept in through the stone. The walls sweated, and something in the hearth was scratching, maybe a rat. I built a fire anyway. The chimney groaned like it hadn't been used in years, though I know my father was still alive only weeks before. The whole house smelled of old ash and rosemary, and something else, something metallic, like rust or blood. I didn't sleep well. There was this humming sound coming through the floorboards. At first I thought it was my imagination, but I swear it rose and fell like breath, just below hearing, low enough to make my teeth itch. I lay there staring at the ceiling, and around 3 a.m, I heard it again. A cry. Faint, like wind through grass, but not random, not natural. It had rhythm, like someone keening, mourning, wailing not in pain, but in terrible ancient grief. I sat up in bed fully awake, and every hair on my arms was standing up. I opened the window. Nothing. Just mist and shadows, and the trees swaying like they were whispering to one another. But I swear to you, it was still there in the distance. That crying. I didn't go outside. I told myself it was a fox, or wind, or even some sheep caught in a fence. Anything but what it really sounded like. But the truth is, I already knew what it was. I just couldn't let myself believe it. Not yet. The next morning I found something on the threshold, a comb. Not just any comb, a jet black one, smooth, carved with spirals like the ones you see on old tombstones. Cold to the touch. I picked it up and felt this strange pressure in my head, like something trying to whisper behind my eyes. I threw it out into the trees. I didn't want it. I knew the stories. You don't pick up a banshee's comb. You don't touch it. You don't bring it into your house. But I already had. Over the next few days, the feeling in the cottage grew heavier. The air thickened, like the walls were closing in. I heard footsteps in the hallway. I saw glimpses of something out of the corner of my eye. A figure dressed in white, pale and thin, drifting just beyond the reach of the light. Sometimes I heard her wail again, louder now, closer. It made my skin crawl. I researched the banshee, banshee, the woman of the fairy mound, a spirit who mourns death in noble families. Was she mourning my father, or was she warning me? The comb was just the beginning. I found an old journal hidden under a loose floorboard. It belonged to my great-grandmother who had lived in this same house. Her words spoke of the banshee as protector and omen, of being bound to their bloodline. She wrote about nights when the banshee would sing, a keening so deep it chilled the soul, about sacrifices made to keep her at bay, about a pact, ancient and binding. I started feeling watched, not just by her, but by the memories trapped in the house, by the past reaching out. One night I heard voices, whispered in Gaelic, soft but urgent. They spoke of death, of fate, of what was to come. I couldn't sleep. I felt her presence pressing closer. And then, at the stroke of midnight, the wail shattered the silence, piercing, haunting, unrelenting. It wasn't just a warning anymore. It was a summons. I stood by the window, trembling. The moon cast long shadows across the fields. Somewhere in the distance, the sound echoed again. A lament so full of sorrow it almost broke me. I wanted to run, to leave this cursed place and never look back. But something rooted me here. An unspoken connection I couldn't deny. I remembered the tales my grandmother told me, stories whispered by firelight, how the banshee was sometimes a lost soul, sometimes a guardian, how she could appear as an old hag or a radiant maiden, how her wail foretold not just death, but transformation. The idea terrified me. I reached out to a local historian, someone who knew more than the books. He told me that the banshee was linked to the Tuatha De Danann, the ancient fairy folk who inhabited the otherworld beneath Ireland's hills. He said the banshee was not evil, but bound to mourn the passing of those she loved, sometimes appearing to warn families of their fate. But why me? I asked. Why my family? He looked at me gravely. Because your bloodline runs deep in this land, the old magic still lingers. That night I dreamed. I saw a woman, white dress flowing, hair like flames, standing at the edge of a misty hill. She looked at me with sorrowful eyes and whispered my name. I woke with tears streaming down my face. The next morning, I found the comb again, this time lying on my pillow. I hadn't brought it in, hadn't touched it since throwing it away. Fear gripped me. What had I unleashed? I knew I had to understand the banshee, to unravel the curse or blessing that tethered her to my family. I began to explore the surrounding countryside, visiting ancient burial mounds, she sites, places locals avoided. The villagers were tight-lipped, eyes darting away when I asked questions. One old woman finally spoke to me. Her voice was cracked, her hands shaking. She told me that the banshee's wail was a sacred lament, a final farewell sung for those crossing into the next world. She warned me not to ignore it, not to dismiss it as superstition. It's both a warning and a mourning, she said. To hear her cries, to know that death walks near. I wanted to believe her, really I did. But in the back of my mind, I thought maybe it was just old wives' tales, stories told to keep children in line or to explain things people couldn't understand. Still, there was something in her eyes, a mix of fear and respect, that made me pause. You don't just hear the banshee's cry once, she added softly. It lingers. It's like the echo of a soul crying out from beyond the veil. Some say the wail cuts through the night like a knife, piercing your heart, chilling your bones. That night as I lay awake, every creak of the house felt louder, every rustle outside sharper. The wind pushed cold drafts through the cracks, and the shadows seemed to twist in unnatural ways. I kept telling myself it was nothing. Foxes, wind, even sheep trapped somewhere. Anything but the truth. But then, from somewhere far beyond the trees, I heard it again. A low, mournful cry, faint at first, like a whisper carried on the wind, but growing steadily more desperate, more agonized. It wasn't just a sound, it was a message, a presence, a sorrow too deep to be understood by those still living. The banshee's wail, they say, isn't meant to frighten for the sake of fear. It is a lament, a mourning for the passing of souls, a reminder of the fragile thread between life and death. And when she cries, it means that thread is about to snap. I remember the stories they told, families who heard the banshees cry hours before a loved one passed. Some claimed they could even recognize whose death she foretold by the tone or intensity of her lament. Others said multiple banshees appeared when a great leader or noble was dying, their combined keening a terrifying chorus of despair. I never wanted to hear it for myself. Yet that night, as the cry echoed through the mist and trees, I realized the tales were more than just stories. They were warnings carved from centuries of sorrow and memory. I didn't sleep. I sat by the window, staring into the dark woods, waiting for whatever was to come. Because when the banshee cries, death is near, and there's no turning away from what she foretells. She warned me not to ignore it, not to dismiss it as superstition. It's both a warning and a mourning, she said. To hear her cries, to know that death walks near. I wanted to believe her, really I did. But in the back of my mind, I thought maybe it was just old wives' tales, stories told to keep children in line or to explain things people couldn't understand. Still, there was something in her eyes, a mix of fear and respect, that made me pause. You don't just hear the banshee's cry once, she added softly. It lingers. It's like the echo of a soul crying out from beyond the veil. Some say the wail cuts through the night like a knife, piercing your heart, chilling your bones. That night as I lay awake, every creak of the house felt louder, every rustle outside sharper. The wind pushed cold drafts through the cracks, and the shadows seemed to twist in unnatural ways. I kept telling myself it was nothing. Foxes, wind, even sheep trapped somewhere. Anything but the truth. But then, from somewhere far beyond the trees, I heard it again. A low, mournful cry, faint at first, like a whisper carried on the wind, but growing steadily more desperate, more agonized. It wasn't just a sound, it was a message, a presence, a sorrow too deep to be understood by those still living. The banshee's wail, they say, isn't meant to frighten for the sake of fear. It is a lament, a mourning for the passing of souls, a reminder of the fragile thread between life and death. And when she cries, it means that thread is about to snap. I remember the stories they told, families who heard the banshees cry hours before a loved one passed. Some claimed they could even recognize whose death she foretold by the tone or intensity of her lament. Others said multiple banshees appeared when a great leader or noble was dying, their combined keening a terrifying chorus of despair. I never wanted to hear it for myself. Yet that night, as the cry echoed through the mist and trees, I realized the tales were more than just stories. They were warnings carved from centuries of sorrow and memory. I didn't sleep. I sat by the window, staring into the dark woods, waiting for whatever was to come. Because when the banshee cries, death is near, and there's no turning away from what she foretells.
The next morning, the world seemed quieter. Too quiet. The usual sounds of birds and rustling leaves were absent, as if nature itself was holding its breath. I couldn't shake the weight of that mournful cry from the night before, like it had settled deep into my bones. I tried to tell myself it was coincidence, that no one I knew was in danger, but my heart didn't believe it. Later that day, news came. A distant relative, someone I hadn't seen in years, had suddenly fallen ill. The timing was impossible to ignore. That's when I understood. This was no random superstition. The banshee's cry was real. It was a bridge between worlds, a voice calling from the other world, warning us that death was close. Some say the banshee is a ghost. Others call her a fairy or a spirit of ancient gods. But whatever she is, she walks the line between life and death. She does not cause death. She mourns it. And if you hear her cry, it means your time, or the time of someone dear, is drawing near. There is a sorrow in her song, a mourning, not just for one life, but for the fragile balance between this world and the next. I didn't want to believe in such things, but now I have no choice. They say the banshee is tied to certain families, ancient Gaelic clans whose bloodline carries the weight of centuries. The O'Neills, the O'Briens, the Kavanaghs, names whispered in old stories, each connected to this spirit who mourns their coming loss. Some believe she's an ancestor, watching over her family, bound by loyalty even in death. Others say she's a fairy from the other world, a guardian of the sacred mounds where the Tuatha De Danann once dwelled. Her appearance changes with the telling. Sometimes she is an old hag, with sunken eyes and wild white hair, draped in tattered cloaks. Her face is gaunt, her eyes red and swollen from endless weeping. Her wail pierces the night like a knife. At other times, she appears as a young woman, radiant and pale, with hair like spun gold or fiery red. She wears a flowing white gown, moving silently through the mist, her voice a soft lament that chills the soul. There are tales of her washing clothes by rivers, stained with the blood of those soon to die, like the Scottish Bean Nye, the washerwoman of the dead. No matter her form, the banshee's cry is the same, a mournful keening that sends a shiver down your spine and presses heavy on your heart. To hear her is to know death walks nearby. It's not a curse. She does not hunt or harm. She mourns, and in that mournful song, there is a strange kind of mercy, an honor in being warned, because in those final hours you might find time to say goodbye. But the banshee's warning is not always clear. Sometimes her cries come late, too late to change fate. Other times they echo through the night, distant and fading, leaving a cold unease that lingers. Some say you can only hear her if you belong to the families she watches over. Others say she appears only to those who will soon face loss. There's a story of the Bunworth Banshee, a spirit tied to a talented musician rather than a noble family. She sang before every death in his life, a sorrowful song that even the living could feel deep in their bones. I've heard tales of people trying to catch a glimpse of her, only to be met with terror. One legend warns that if you find her comb, you might keep it for a wish, but misfortune will follow if you don't return it. The banshee doesn't speak much. Her voice is her message, piercing, mournful, sometimes blood-curdling. Sometimes there are more than one. When multiple banshees gather, it's said the death will be of someone great, or a tragedy that shakes the land. Despite the fear she inspires, she's not a harbinger of evil. Her cries are not meant to frighten for sport. They're a lament, a mourning, a warning so the living can prepare for what's to come. It's strange to think of death as something heralded with such sorrow, almost respect. The banshee's wail is a bridge between worlds, the living and the dead, the seen and unseen. And when you hear it, you are reminded of the fragile thread that holds life together. I tried to sleep that night, burying myself under the duvet like it could keep the sound out, or worse, keep something else from getting in. But every so often, I'd hear it again. Faint, mournful, a single cry stretched into a silence that felt too still. No birds, no wind, just that awful quiet. My ears strained for anything else, traffic, dogs, even the hum of the boiler. But the house was holding its breath with me. The next morning I asked Gran again. What happens if someone ignores it? I asked, trying to sound casual, like I hadn't been wide-eyed in bed for hours. She looked up from her tea, her eyes clearer than they usually were. Then it takes what it came for, she said simply. I laughed, nervously. It's not a thing, Gran, it's a sound. She didn't laugh. It's not the sound you need to be afraid of. It's what follows it. That evening I went out with the dog. The sun was going down behind the hills, and the air was cold enough to make my breath cloud. I told myself I was being brave, curious even. But really I just didn't want to be inside, waiting. I followed the path behind the house, down toward the brook, trying to remember how the land looked when it wasn't cloaked in unease. The dog froze first, hackles up, ears stiff. Then he whimpered, low and terrified, and backed toward me, nearly knocking me over. I heard it again. It was closer this time. Not loud, not a scream, just sorrow, human and not. Like someone had cracked open grief itself and let it echo across the land. My mouth went dry. The dog bolted, leash dragging behind him. I should have followed him. I should have turned and run, but I stood there, every part of me aching with dread. She was standing by the brook. At first, I thought it was just mist, curling off the water like usual. But the shape didn't move like mist. It moved like cloth, like arms, like hair lifting gently in the breeze. I couldn't see her face, only her outline, slim, bent slightly forward, her long dress dragging in the wet grass. She turned her head slowly, not toward me, but as if listening. The cry came again, not from her lips, but from the space around her. It vibrated through my chest, sharp and aching, and then she vanished. No burst, no rush, no smoke, just gone. The air folded in on itself, and I was alone again by the brook. I ran back, heart pounding, feet slipping in the mud. The dog was already at the door, scratching like mad to get inside. We didn't go out again that night. When Gran saw me, she didn't ask. She just nodded and said, "Now you understand." I didn't sleep that night. Not really. Every creak of the old house, every gust of wind against the windows felt like her breath on the glass. I lay there, eyes wide, Gran's words echoing in my head. It's both a warning and a mourning. But for whom? I thought about calling Mom or Uncle Finn, maybe even the priest. But what would I say? That I saw a woman made of mist crying by the brook? That I felt death hovering like fog in the hall? No. They'd say I was just tired. Maybe grieving, maybe overworked, maybe still rattled from moving back here.
but I knew better. The next morning, Gran was already up. She was always up early, but this time, she wasn't making tea or listening to the old wireless. She was sitting at the kitchen table, rosary wrapped tight around her hand, muttering prayers under her breath. "She's not done," Gran said without looking up. "She doesn't show herself for nothing." I sat down slowly, watching her knotted fingers glide over the beads. "Who, Gran? Who's going to—" She looked at me then, and it chilled me more than the banshee ever could. There was pity in her eyes, and fear. "Don't go to town today," she said. "Don't take the road past the hollow, and don't answer if you hear her again. Not this time." But I did. Of course I did. There's something about being warned not to do a thing that makes it impossible not to do it. Maybe it's pride, or denial, or just the stupid kind of bravery that comes from wanting the world to make sense again. I told myself it was all a story, that Gran was old and tired and maybe even losing her grip a little. I said I'd just go into town for bread and come right back. Just a quick drive. No stopping by the brook, no slowing down by the hollow. But as I turned the corner near the old trees, I saw it. Not her, but the comb. A thin, pale thing lying in the middle of the road, like it had been dropped there on purpose. Old-fashioned. Bone, maybe, or ivory. The kind of thing you'd expect to find in a museum, not on a wet country road. I hit the brakes, hard. I didn't want to touch it, but I couldn't drive past it either. It didn't feel right to leave it there, like I'd be inviting something worse. So I opened the doors, stepped out, and picked it up. The moment my fingers closed around it, I swear the air changed. Colder, still. No bird song, no wind. Even the engine sounded quieter. Then I heard it again, that cry. Not far now, not distant and ghostly, but close. So close I could almost feel it moving through me. I stood there, clutching the comb, my breath fogging in the stillness. It wasn't just the sound that chilled me. It was what was beneath it. Grief. Agony. Something so ancient and raw that my body knew it before my mind did. She was near. I didn't run. I don't know why. Maybe I thought if I moved too fast, it would notice me. Maybe I thought I could vanish if I stood still long enough. But the crying didn't fade. It grew fuller, deeper. Not louder, just closer. Like it wasn't a sound at all, but a presence. Then the trees to my left shifted, not swayed, not wrestled, shifted, like they were moving aside for something. That's when I saw her, not all at once, just a glimpse, a shimmer between branches, a pale shape, tall and thin, draped in something tattered that moved like smoke. Her hair was long and silver in the half-light, and I could see her hands, white and bony, the fingers curled like she was wringing them in sorrow. But no face, or rather, I couldn't hold on to what her face was. Every time I looked, it seemed to shift, old and young, beautiful and terrible, like she was every woman who had ever mourned. She looked at me, no, through me, and then she stopped wailing, just silence, complete and punishing. I don't know how long we stood like that. Me, frozen with the comb clenched in my fist, her motionless among the trees, watching me with eyes I couldn't see. Then she raised her hand, slowly, gently, and pointed behind me. I turned. There on the ridge above the house stood a man, my father, only he wasn't moving. He just stood there, arms at his sides, eyes staring down toward us. And in that moment I knew. I didn't need her to speak, to cry again. I knew he was already gone. The wind picked up, sudden and sharp. When I turned back to where she had been, the banshee was gone. No rustling of leaves, no final cry. Just the comb in my hand and the weight of the truth pressing down on my chest. I didn't scream. I didn't cry. I just walked back to the house and waited. The phone rang an hour later. A car crashed, a winding road slick with rain. They said he died instantly. They were wrong, because she'd cried for him. She'd mourned him before the world even noticed he was missing, and I had heard it all.
The days that followed were a blur of condolences and casseroles. Neighbors came and went, their faces long and hushed, their eyes flicking to me, like I held some otherworldly truth they didn't dare touch. I didn't tell them what I saw, not even Ma'am, especially not Ma'am. But every night after, I heard the wail again. Not close, not like that night, but faint, echoing from the hills. A sound that wrapped around the wind and burrowed beneath the skin. It was different now, softer, almost sorrowful. Ma'am kept lighting candles by the window. She said it was to guide his soul, but I wondered if it was also to keep her out. The woman in the woods, the one who had taken him before we even knew he was gone. I started to dream about her. In those dreams she stood at the foot of my bed, silent, her face obscured by her long, white hair. I never saw her eyes, only the pale gleam of her skin, the steady drip of water from her gown, like she had crossed some river to reach me. Each morning I woke up shivering, damp with sweat, the comb always on my desk, though I had locked it in a drawer the night before. By the third night, I couldn't pretend it was coincidence. She was coming back. For me? For someone else? Ma'am grew quieter. She wouldn't talk about the old stories anymore. When I asked her about the banshee, she'd just shake her head and whisper, "Don't invite her in." But it was too late. I already had. The sky had been gray for days, heavy, still, like something was waiting. Even the birds were silent. I stopped going into town. People looked at me strangely, like I carried something on me. Grief, maybe, or a curse. I thought about burning the comb, just taking it out back and setting fire to it. But part of me knew it wouldn't matter. You don't get to erase an invitation once it's accepted. Not with her. Not with something as old as the banshee. That night I sat at the kitchen table long after Ma'am had gone to bed. I watched the candle flicker by the window and listened to the creak of the trees. At first I thought it was just the house settling, the usual night noises of old wood and wind. But then I heard it again. Not a cry this time. A breath, right behind me. I turned, slow, too scared to blink. Nothing, but the air had changed, thicker, colder. My own breath hung in front of me, though the stove was still burning. And then the comb slid across the table. Just an inch, just enough to say, "I'm still here." I didn't scream. I couldn't. My body had gone tight, frozen. I picked up the comb with shaking hands and ran upstairs, locked the door behind me and stuffed it under the floorboard. But as I lay there, trying to slow my heartbeat, the crying began again. Not from outside, no, from inside the walls. It moved through the house like water through pipes, soft at first, then louder, closer,
a low, keening cry like grief trapped in a human throat for far too long. I pressed my ear to the wall, not knowing why. Maybe I thought it was Ma'am. Maybe I hoped it was something explainable, but it wasn't. She was in the house. I heard footsteps across the landing, slow, dragging. I stayed still, breathing through my teeth, praying not to be heard. The handle of my door twitched, just once, then silence, and then her voice. Not words, not language, just sorrow. Raw, naked sorrow, muffled by the wooden door. And something else, like nails on the other side, scratching, not to get in, but to remind me she could. When I dared to open the door hours later, there was nothing, no sign of her, but a wet footprint stained the hallway floor. There, small, like a child's. Ma'am never mentioned hearing a thing. She just looked at me, tired, afraid, like she knew what was coming. She grew quiet after that, moved slower, slept more. I tried to keep her warm, made her tea, sat beside her when she dozed, but I could feel it, the presence, watching, waiting. Every night, the crying got louder. Every night, the shadows in the corners grew longer. And still, Ma'am said nothing. Until the morning her voice came back, not with words of comfort, but a single whisper. She's come for me. Warning Ma'am whispered those words, the air felt colder than ever. I watched her face, pale and drawn, her eyes heavy with a sorrow I couldn't reach. She told me that about the family, about the blood that ties us to the land, to the spirits that walk just beyond our sight. She said the banshee's wail wasn't a curse, but a burden, a sorrow carried through generations. That some families were marked, destined to hear the warning cry before death touched them. She doesn't come for everyone, Ma'am said. Only those who carry the old blood, those with a past that stretches back to the fairy mounds. I wanted to believe she was wrong, wanted to tell myself it was just old stories, superstition clinging to the edges of a modern world. But then I heard it again. That keening, echoing through the night, a sound that clawed its way into my dreams. She warned me not to ignore it, not to dismiss it as superstition. It's both a warning and a mourning, she said. To hear her cry is to know that death walks near. I tried to argue, to say it was just the wind or some animal caught in the dark, but deep down, I knew better. The banshee's cry was a message, ancient and relentless. The problem was, no one ever said what you're supposed to do once you hear her. No prayers to say, no charms to wear, just that terrible knowing that death is coming and nothing can stop it. I started paying closer attention. Every night, when the wind rustled through the trees and the moon hid behind clouds, that wailing would return, soft at first, like a distant sorrow, then growing louder, more desperate. It wasn't just a sound, it was a presence, something ancient and sorrowful slipping through the veil between this world and the next. My grandmother's voice echoed in my mind. It's both a warning and a mourning. To hear her cry is to know that death walks near. At first, I thought it was some old superstition, an echo of a fading culture clinging to its ghosts. But the nights stretched on and the feeling of impending loss grew heavier in my chest. I started searching for stories, old family tales whispered in corners and faded letters tucked away in dusty boxes. The banshee wasn't just a myth. She was tied to my bloodline, to the very roots of my family, and her wail was no random sound in the night. It was a message. I wondered, who was she mourning? Who would be next? The more I dug into the stories, the more I realized the banshee's connection ran deeper than I imagined. She wasn't some random spirit. She was tied to the ancient Gallic families, or with names starting with O and Mac. Families who carried the weight of centuries on their shoulders. My surname was among them. The old texts spoke of her different forms, sometimes a ragged old woman with wild white hair and red eyes swollen from crying. Other times a beautiful maiden in a shimmering white gown, her hair glowing like fire in the dark. Some said she appeared as a washerwoman by the river, scrubbing blood-stained clothes, a grim omen of death to come. But no matter her form, her cry was unmistakable. People said only those tied to her families could hear her wail. Some even claimed that multiple banshees gathering meant the death of someone important or holy. I kept hearing her in the distance, but I still didn't know who she mourned. Every night the question twisted inside me, gnawing at my sanity.
Days turned into restless nights. The banshee's cry haunted me like a shadow I couldn't shake. I started seeing her in glimpses. Out of the corner of my eye, a pale figure drifting among the trees, her hair flowing like mist, her eyes filled with endless sorrow. Sometimes she seemed close, almost within reach. Other times, just a whisper carried on the wind. One evening, I found an old family portrait in my grandmother's attic. Among the stern faces and faded colors was a woman who looked hauntingly like the descriptions I'd read. A pale woman in a tattered cloak, her eyes rimmed red with tears. The note on the back said simply, "Annalisa, our guardian." Could she have been the banshee, an ancestor who never left? That night, the cry came again, louder, more urgent. It was no longer just a warning, felt like a plea, like she was calling for help, for release. I realized then that the banshee wasn't just a death omen. She was trapped, bound to a fate I was beginning to understand, but wasn't ready to face. Just mist and shadows, and the trees swaying like they were whispering to one another. But I swear to you it was still there, in the distance, that crying. I didn't go outside. I told myself it was a fox, or wind, or even some sheep caught in a fence. Anything but what it really sounded like. She warned me not to ignore it, not to dismiss it as superstition. It's both a warning and a mourning, she said. To hear her cry is to know that death walks near. The banshee's wail was never a promise of immediate death, but an omen. Sometimes days before, sometimes hours, and sometimes just a whisper of a distant sorrow we couldn't escape. I couldn't shake the chill, the way the hairs on the back of my neck stood on end every time I heard it again, low, fading, then rising into a keening that seemed to curl around the edges of my mind. It was more than a sound, it was a presence, heavy and inevitable. She said the banshee was bound to bloodlines, to families rooted deep in the old soil of Ireland. Not everyone could hear her, but if she came for you, you would know. The cry cut deeper than any blade. That night, I stayed by the window, watching shadows pool beneath the trees, waiting, listening. The cry grew louder, closer, then silence. In the morning, I learned my grandmother had passed in her sleep. The old woman, keeper of stories, had heard the banshee's lament before me. Some say the banshee is a mourning mother, some say an angry spirit, but I think she is something in between, a reminder that death is never far, and the living must honor the dead with grief and respect, because in her cry is a truth we cannot deny. Everything ends. After my grandmother's passing, I found myself drawn deeper into the stories she told me. The old tales of the banshee, the woman of the fairy mound. I started to understand why she warned me so fiercely. She said the banshee is no ordinary spirit. She's tied to the ancient bloodlines, those families who carry the old magic and the old grief. It's not just a random cry in the night. It's a bond that spans generations, sometimes even centuries. Some say the banshee appears in different forms. Sometimes an old hag, pale and withered, eyes swollen from endless weeping. Other times a young maiden in a white gown, her hair flowing like liquid silver in the moonlight. And then there's the washerwoman, standing by rivers, scrubbing the bloodied clothes of the dead. I tried to see her, to catch a glimpse when the cry came, but she never showed herself clearly. Always just shadows at the edge of sight, a flicker of movement that vanished when I blinked. What terrified me most wasn't the wail itself,
but the knowledge that she came not to take life, but to mourn it, a sorrow so deep it broke the silence of the night, echoing the loss that was coming. In my heart, I knew that the cry was for me, for my family, for the part of history I carry without realizing it. And yet, even knowing this, I felt no rage or fear, only a strange comfort. The banshee's song was a call to remember, to prepare, to honor what must come and what is past. I found myself standing at the edge of the woods one misty evening, the wind tugging at my coat, the trees whispering secrets older than time. And for a moment, I thought I heard her again, the banshee's lament, fading into the distance, a sound both terrible and beautiful.
The nights grew colder, and the wail came more often. Each time, I felt the weight of the past pressing down on me, a connection to something I couldn't fully explain, but couldn't ignore. My grandmother's warnings echoed in my mind. Respect her cry. It's not meant to frighten you, but to remind you. One night, I stayed awake listening through the thick silence. The mist curled low over the fields, and the trees seemed to lean closer, as if eager to share their secret. Then, from the darkness, I heard it again, the keening cry, raw and mournful, carrying a sorrow so deep it seemed to pierce my very soul. I stood and stepped outside, the cold biting at my skin, and I felt the presence before I saw her. There in the shadows beneath the ancient oaks was a figure half seen but unmistakable. Her eyes were hollow, red-rimmed with endless weeping. Her hair fell like silver threads, tangled and wild. She wore a tattered cloak, gray as the mist that surrounded her. She looked at me, not with menace, but with grief. "She comes for those she watches over," I whispered. "She mourns the living as much as the dead." The banshee's wail filled the night once more, a sound of loss and warning, sorrow and love intertwined. And as the first light of dawn broke, she faded into the mist, leaving me with a quiet peace I hadn't known before. The cry was still there, distant but no longer frightening. It was a reminder, a bond to the past, to family, to the mysteries that live just beyond our sight. And now I listen not with fear, but with reverence,